Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. If you close your eyes and imagine a cave in France some 10,000 years ago, the air would be damp, heavy with the scent of limestone and soil, the walls faintly glittering with moisture. It is here in Lascaux that generations of humans found a way to paint their lives into permanence, or so they believed. Bulls, stags, horses, and abstract signs unfurled across rock like messages to the future. But not all of these images survived. Some were scraped away deliberately. With silence, the story begins in the Dordogne region, where the now famous cave system was first rediscovered in 1940 by four boys chasing their dog. They stumbled upon chambers that contained some of the finest Paleolithic art ever found. The animals seemed to leap from the walls, crafted with ochre, manganese, and charcoal. Every detail's hooves, even the suggestion of breath, was painstakingly etched and shaded by torchlight. Yet, in one hidden chamber, tucked far from the main galleries, traces of something unusual were found. Smooth rock walls where pigments once clung but had been erased. Why would early humans labor so intensely to create art, only to destroy it? Archaeologists puzzled over the blank surfaces. Scraping marks were clear, almost as if stone tools had been used to scour the wall clean. The surface had been stripped of color, leaving only ghostly impressions. Was it ritual, punishment, or an attempt to rewrite memory? To understand this, you need to imagine what art meant to the people of the Upper Paleolithic. For them, painting was not entertainment or idle expression. It was bound to survival, to belief. A bison drawn on a wall might ensure the success of a hunt. A series of dots or handprints might mark an initiation rite, a passage into adulthood, or the mapping of stars. When art was erased, something deeper was at stake. The blank walls of Lascaux hint at conflict between groups. Perhaps a rival clan entered the cave and destroyed the images of another, just as ancient kings would later chisel out the names of their enemies on monuments. Power was often displayed in erasure, not only creation. A painting removed meant a voice silenced, but the erasures may not have been violent. Some scholars suggest they were part of a renewal process. Paintings might have been cleared to make room for new ones, in the same way parchment was later scraped and reused by medieval scribes. If so, the erasures tell us less about destruction than about continuity. Community trying to keep its cave alive by overwriting its own history. Yet another theory lingers that the erasures were ritual purifications. Imagine a shaman scraping away the figure of a wounded horse because the hunt had gone wrong, removing a bull because its spirit was too dangerous to be kept on the wall. The cave was a sacred place, but also a perilous one, where art and magic blurred. The silence of the scraped chamber is heavy because we cannot know for sure. Archaeologists found no pigments on the floor, no tools left behind. The wall looks as if it had been scrubbed yesterday, though it happened thousands of years ago. Was it the act of a single hand or a whole group? Was it a quiet decision or a desperate one? Today, when tourists think of Lascaux, they imagine the magnificent hall of the bulls with its swirling herds. Few think of the blank wall, yet it is the blankness that tells a quieter, stranger story. For in history, sometimes what is missing speaks louder than what survives. If a mural disappears, does it still carry meaning? Was the act of erasure itself the real message one we are not equipped to read? The cave waits in silence, smooth wall holding a question that has lingered for 10,000 years. Asterisk, asterisk, when the story of the scraped cave mural is retold. It often seems like an isolated mystery, a shadowy act committed in silence. But if we step further back into the quiet administrative corridors and cultural debates of the 20th century, the scraping becomes less a singular act and more a reflection of broader tensions about what counts as history and who gets to decide how it is preserved. In Spain, where the cave of El Castillo sits among the rugged Cantabrian cliffs, the early to mid-1900s were decades of upheaval. The Spanish Civil War had ripped apart institutions, destroyed cultural infrastructure, and displaced scholars. The war wasn't only fought on battlefields, but also in archives, libraries, and museums. Fires consumed parish records, monasteries were looted, and artworks were defaced or hidden. In such an atmosphere, prehistory itself became politicized. To some, the Paleolithic murals represented a national treasure, proof of Spain's deep roots in European civilization. To others, they were irrelevant distractions, signs of a primitive past better left untouched as the state sought to construct new narratives of strength, order, and Catholic unity. When archaeologists first rediscovered and documented the El Castillo murals, they did so with fragile tools and rudimentary methods. Photography was still in its infancy, chemical preservation was largely experimental, and debates raged about whether touching, cleaning, or even breathing in the caves endangered the fragile pigments. Reports from the 1920s and 1930s show archaeologists scraping small sections of cave walls deliberately, not out of malice, but as a way to test pigment layers, identify mineral compositions, or prepare samples for study in distant laboratories. These sacrifices were often seen as necessary in order to advance knowledge. Though the act today feels destructive, it is entirely possible, then, that the great scraping of the El Castillo mural was not performed secretly in the dead of Take-Cond night, but rather methodically, even bureaucratically. A decision taken at a desk, signed with a pen, and carried out by men who believed they were preserving knowledge rather than erasing it. The silence comes not from the absence of intent, but from the absence of records. Files misplaced during wartime, reports burned, archived under ambiguous labels, core never written at all. Yet, there are also cultural layers of meaning to consider. By the mid-20th century, European intellectuals were beginning to see prehistoric art not merely as decoration, but as symbolic systems. Theories swirled. Some argued that dots and hand stencils were calendars of seasonal hunts. Others, that they marked rites of passage or religious taboos. If these marks carried meaning, then the decision to scrape them away could itself have been ideological, a dismissal of inconvenient interpretations, a desire to reduce complex systems of early human life to the simpler narrative of art for art's sake. There is another dimension often overlooked: tourism. By the 1950s, Spain's economy was opening to foreign visitors, and caves became attractions. Lascaux, in France, with its dramatic paintings of bison and horses, was drawing thousands each year. El Castillo, though quieter, was also promoted as part of Europe's deep prehistory. Cave walls, blackened by the breath of visitors, murals, touched by countless fingers, threatened to decay rapidly. In some caves, replicas were constructed to protect originals. In others, curators made harsh decisions: better to scrape away damaged or illegible art than let tourists imagine Spain's caves were poorly preserved. The clean white surface may have seemed, paradoxically, like an act of respect, a way to preserve the cave for future generations, even if it meant sacrificing part of its past. And still, as one looks at the smooth, scraped wall of El Castillo, one cannot help but wonder about the intentions of individuals. Did a single archaeologist make the choice, out of conviction, that scientific progress justified destruction? Did a bureaucrat see the mural as irrelevant to the national story he wanted to tell? Or did caretakers of the cave, weary of constant debates, simply take a chisel to the wall one day, scraping in silence, believing no one would miss what was already fading? This tension between preservation and erasure, between science and ideology, between public display and private neglect, forms the heart of the mural's disappearance. It reflects a larger question that haunts all of archaeology. How do we decide which fragments of the past to protect and which to let slip quietly into oblivion? As we pause here, standing in the dimly lit chambers of El Castillo, with the ghost of a mural lost yet still whispered about in scholarly circles, another question arises. If this scraping was part of a wider pattern, if countless marks, murals, stencils across Europe were erased in the name of science, politics, or tourism, then how much of humanity's earliest story has already been lost, not to time, but to deliberate human choice? The Lascaux Caves. Long after the frantic days of wartime discovery and the brief, glorious years of public access slipped into a kind of paradoxical fate, to be forgotten, yet too fragile to be truly seen again, when the cave was officially closed to the public in 1963. Following decades of scientific warnings, its silence deepened into something almost funereal. The air inside grew carefully managed, the visitors reduced to a handful of specialists, and the once joyous, active children lighting lamps to reveal painted bulls and stags became a memory carried only in photographs. But for many, the question remained, why had some of the murals been scraped clean in silence? And what did it mean that humankind, in its attempt to preserve, had also erased? By the late 20th century, the cave was not merely closed, but entombed in layers of debate. To one side stood the preservationists, those who argued that scraping away contaminated pigment was the only way to save what remained. To the other side were the cultural guardians who saw in the scraped surfaces a second act of vandalism, not by nature, but by human hands. For them, the loss was compounded. The air had taken some of the paintings, but in the act of cleaning, human beings had deliberately removed parts of the Paleolithic voice. And yet, beneath these arguments, the caves themselves remained. Stone, indifferent to both camps. In the silence of Lascaux, the scientific instruments hummed faintly. Microbiologists tracked spores. Mycologists traced fungi that sprouted in tiny colonies across once pristine surfaces, and chemists measured minute changes in air composition. The scraped walls, in their blankness, told a different kind of story, not one of galloping herds or antlered beasts, but of the frailty of human stewardship. Each patch of whitened wall stood as a record of an intervention, a scar of our attempt to undo what centuries of stillness had preserved. Meanwhile, the public's memory of Lascaux drifted into something mythic. Because the caves were no longer accessible, they grew in imagination. Photographic reproductions circulated, exhibitions recreated fragments, and later, full-scale replicas Lascaux II, Lascaux III, and even Lascaux for allowed people to walk among reconstructed chambers, painted painstakingly by artisans to mirror every stroke. For many visitors, these replicas were all they would ever know. And here lay another paradox. In order to save the caves, humanity had to create false caves. To glimpse Lascaux today is, for almost everyone, to glimpse an imitation, while the real site, the authentic stone, remains sealed. And yet, the scraped murals linger in scholarly debates. Did the interventions of the mid-20th century destroy evidence that we will never recover? Could microscopic analysis have preserved pigment that brushes in the 1950s and 1960s washed away? Or was the scraping necessary, a small sacrifice to prevent greater loss? These are the kinds of questions that can never truly be answered, only circled around. Like the repeated spiral motifs some prehistoric painters favored. The larger story, perhaps, is not the fate of one cave, but of how we confront the past itself. For the Paleolithic artists who lay on their backs, blowing ochre through hollow bones to stencil their handprints across the walls, preservation was unthinkable. Their act was immediate, ceremonial, tied to survival and meaning in their time. The endurance of the murals for millennia was an accident of geology, of stable temperatures and sealed chambers. For modern people, by contrast, preservation became the overriding concern, even at the cost of alteration. We entered the caves, not to live within them, but to freeze them, to hold time still. In doing so, we also introduced an irony. The more closely we tried to hold, the more damage we risked inflicting. Standing at the threshold of the cave today, which only a handful of caretakers may do, one does not hear the shouts of children discovering the paintings, nor the footsteps of thousands of post-war tourists. There is only the whisper of controlled airflow, the hum of monitors, and the quiet marks of scraping visible on walls that once bore ancient visions. The silence is heavy and perhaps intentional. It forces a recognition that not everything from the past can be saved intact, and not every act of protection is without its shadow. So the question lingers, unresolved. Did the scraping of the murals save Lascaux, or did it leave behind a second kind of erasure, one committed not by time, but by us? Asterisk. The story begins not with a famous city or a mighty empire, but with the hushed outline of a forgotten village, so old that its name never survived, and so plain that even its ruins lie buried under a mound of earth, mistaken for nothing more. Vanna Hill, somewhere in the Near East, where farming first took hold after the last ice age, people built walls of mud, brick, and plaster. Their homes were cramped, flat-roofed rectangles, their streets narrow and unplanned. Yet, within those modest walls, the earliest experiments in art, ritual, and memory unfolded. Archaeologists stumbled upon such a place in the mid-20th century, unearthing a Neolithic settlement that scholars today often link with sites like Ketal Yuk in modern-day Turkey, or even older farming hamlets spread across the Fertile Crescent. What struck researchers was not the architecture, though the honeycomb of windowless rooms was unusual, but the paintings and reliefs pressed directly into the plastered walls. Imagine walking through one of these houses. You enter by climbing. Down from the roof, your feet sinking into a packed, earthen floor. The walls, coated in layers of white plaster, glow faintly in the dim light of a small hearth. And there, painted in red ochre or carved into wet plaster, are scenes that tell stories: hunters chasing wild cattle, vultures looming over headless human figures, geometric patterns repeating like the echoes of a forgotten language. These were not idle decorations. In a world without writing, they were memory and ritual, belief and warning. They were how a people recorded who they were and what mattered. But something strange happened. Over centuries, many of these murals and reliefs were deliberately plastered over. Archaeologists, peeling back the hardened layers, found older paintings sealed away like the pages of a book shut too soon. A new mural would appear, only to be covered again by a fresh coat of plaster, erasing what came before. This was not random maintenance. It was deliberate silencing of the past by those who lived in the present. The cycle repeated. Build, paint, scrape, cover. Entire lifetimes of imagery disappeared under the trowel and lime, leaving only ghostly traces. Why would a community spend precious time and effort decorating its walls, only to erase them later? Why would they seal away the stories of their own ancestors? Some scholars argued the act itself was ritual. The walls were alive, in a sense, layered with memory. Each new generation needed to bury the old symbols and replace them with their own, showing that the living controlled the stories told within their homes. Others suggest it was an effort to tame dangerous images scenes too sacred or too frightening to be left exposed, especially in rooms where children played or meals were cooked. Whatever the reason, the result was striking. By the time the village was abandoned, most of its murals were gone from view. The people had created a cycle of expression and erasure, a rhythm of memory and forgetting. What we see today is not their art, but the scars of their decision to hide it. This act of painting and then covering echoes through later history. In churches, frescoes have been whitewashed. In temples, idols smashed. In palaces, inscriptions chiseled away. Yet this small village did it long before kings and empires arose. It shows us that the urge to silence the past is not the invention of rulers. It begins in the home, in the hearth, among ordinary people. When archaeologists finally uncovered these walls, they were forced to peel history backwards, stripping away layer after layer. Each one revealed a ghost of a different moment in time. A bull hunt from one century, a vulture scene from another, and beneath them, the faintest traces of geometric marks, barely visible. It was as if the villagers had left behind not a single story, but a palimpsest of competing memories not allowed to dominate for long. Yet one question lingers. If memory was so fragile that it had to be covered and replaced, what did the villagers truly fear? Was it the danger of forgetting, or the danger of remembering too much? When archaeologists brushed away the hardened plaster, they realized something unsettling. The walls of that ancient village were not blank by accident. They were deliberately silenced, layer upon layer, like a library of stories locked away and never meant to be read again. It is tempting to imagine that these early farmers, barely scraping a living from the soil, had little time for complicated beliefs. But the evidence says otherwise. Every act of painting, carving, and then burying carried meaning. To them, plaster was not just a building material, it was a skin. Each new layer entombed the images beneath, as though the house itself needed renewal, as though the past had to be sealed before the present could breathe. Why would they do this? Some anthropologists point to death rituals. At sites like Yuk, human remains were found beneath floors, tucked into shallow graves, beneath the very rooms where families cooked, slept, and argued. Ancestors were literally underfoot. The walls above them carried painted vultures devouring human bodies, or headless figures surrounded by birds. These were not random doodles. They were meditations on mortality. Covering them may have been a way of closing one chapter of grief and opening another. Others see politics hidden in the plaster. In small farming communities, power did not rest in thrones or armies, but in control of ritual and memory. To cover one mural and paint another was to declare whose version of the story would survive. Perhaps one lineage, one household, erased. The symbols of another, stamping their authority on the shared space. A red bull painted by one family might be scraped away to make room for a vulture by another. Each erasure was both an ending and a proclamation. There is also a simpler, almost psychological explanation. Images hold power. Drawing of a predator on the wall is not just art, it becomes a presence. It's for people who lived with a constant threat of death from disease, famine, or attack. Leaving those images exposed might have felt dangerous. Covering them did not mean forgetting them. It meant keeping their force contained, safe behind plaster. This act of silencing, painting over, sealing away was not unique to this one village. Across the world, people repeated the same gestures. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs chiseled out the names of rivals from stone. In Mesopotamia, kings buried the foundation tablets of their predecessors under new inscriptions. In medieval Europe, church walls bore frescoes that were later whitewashed by reformers who feared their messages. The cycle of creation and erasure echoes like a heartbeat through human history. But here, this anonymous Neolithic settlement, we see the pattern in its rawest form. The villagers were not erasing empires or rewriting theology. They were painting over their own story, scrubbing clean the faces of their own ancestors. It suggests that even in the earliest experiments of settled life, people understood a profound truth. Memory is power. Power is fragile. Archaeologists digging through the ruins describe the sensation of peeling back time as unsettling. Each plaster layer lifted was like opening a sealed envelope. A geometric pattern would emerge, its red lines still sharp despite lying hidden for centuries. Beneath that, another scene, more abstract, almost ghostly, fading into the whiteness of plaster dust. It was like hearing voices buried under voices, each speaking in turn, but none allowed to dominate for long. What makes this cycle stranger is that it was costly. Plastering required labor to gather lime, burn it, mix it, and spread it smooth across walls was not a small task for a community that already struggled with farming, hunting, and survival. Yet they returned to it again and again. They were willing to spend time and effort, not just on painting, but on bearing what they had painted. This was not neglect. It was devotion. Perhaps it was their way of living with change. A mural might belong to one moment, one season, one ritual. When that moment passed, it was sealed away. In a world without writing, the past was too heavy to carry openly. Better to bury it, layer by layer, and trust that memory could be managed like soil on a field turned, covered, renewed. Yet, in doing so, they left behind a paradox. The act of erasing preserved the images. Had the murals remained exposed, smoke from hearth fires and wear of time would have destroyed them. Instead, sealed in their plaster tombs, they survived for thousands of years. What the villagers sought to hide, archaeologists rediscovered. Their silencing became, unintentionally, a way of speaking to us across 10 millennia. We are left with questions. Did the villagers believe they were protecting themselves from the images, or protecting the images from themselves? Did they mean to erase memory, or to preserve it in secret for future eyes? The plaster does not answer. It only waits, a mute witness, two choices made in silence. Asterisk by the time the 20th century fully arrived. The painted menhirs had become less monuments of the distant past and more battlegrounds, questions about who truly owned history. Local villagers still spoke of them in hushed tones, sometimes weaving new myths around the stones, while archaeologists treated them as fragile pages from an immense book. The two ways of looking at the menhirs rarely aligned. In some regions of southern France and Corsica, the stones were fenced off to prevent livestock from rubbing against them, their paint now barely visible. Acute. In others, fences were ignored. Sheep still grazed freely, and children still clambered over the carvings as though they were no different from any other boulder. Archaeologists fretted about fading pigment, while farmers dismissed those concerns with a shrug. The stones had been there for thousands of years. Surely they would remain for thousands more. But as decades passed, another reality emerged. Time itself was eating away at the evidence. Rain, salt, lichen, and wind gradually eroded what little paint had survived. A fragment of ochre here, a faint black line there. Even without human interference, the menhirs were disappearing. What had been dismissed as crude decoration was, in truth, delicate survival of the Neolithic imagination. By the mid-century, museums began quietly relocating some stones indoors, uplifting a heavy menhir out of its landscape and placing it under artificial, light-traced new debates. Was the stone still meaningful once torn from the place it had been raised? Or did its removal save it from certain oblivion? A farmer might look out on a field, suddenly missing its marker, and feel something intangible had been stolen. Yet, curator in Paris could run a hand gently across a faint line of ochre and know that pigment had been spared for another 50 years. The silence of the missing paint came almost louder than the images themselves. Scholars began publishing careful reconstructions of what the designs might once have looked like. Broad swirls across the stone's flanks, painted eyes staring outward, torsos marked with bands of red. These reconstructions were not wild guesses, but careful extrapolations based on microscopic pigment traces. And yet they remained guesses, forever incomplete, forever speculative. The menhir's original meanings, like the hands that carved them, would remain unseen. Meanwhile, other cultures reclaimed the stones in ways science could not anticipate. In Sardinia, folk festivals quietly incorporated them, wreathing them with flowers on certain feast days. In Corsica, new superstitions arose. A woman who touched the carved chest of a menhir might conceive more easily. A man who tied a thread around its base might be protected at sea. These traditions may have been modern inventions, but they reflected something timeless, that the stones had never fully lost their aura. Even stripped of their color by the late 20th century, only a fraction of painted menhirs were even recognized for what they were. Many others remained unstudied, serving as boundary markers, waypoints, or simply curiosities. Archaeologists mapped and cataloged where they could, but funding rarely stretched far. The stones lived double lives, sacred relics and scholarly articles, everyday obstacles in the plowed fields where they stood. And so we are left today with a paradox. The menhirs, once painted so boldly, now stand bare, silent, and largely ignored. Their mystery deepens, not from what is visible, but from what is lost. They force us to wonder, were they gods, ancestors, maps, or warnings? Or were they, as some argue, nothing more than communal art and expression of the human urge to mark presence in a world otherwise unmarked? The last strokes of pigment fade even now. Every passing season scrapes away a little more. What remains are stones mute, imposing and stubborn. They invite us to imagine what cannot be proved, to reconstruct what cannot be fully seen. And perhaps that is their final lesson. The menhirs endure, but their colors do not. The silence around them may not be an accident of time, but part of the truth. They carry that memory, no matter how carefully painted, always fades. In the middle of central India, not far from the city of Bhopal, a ridge of sandstone rises from the flat landscape like the spine of some long-forgotten creature. To a casual traveler, it may seem unremarkable, just another stretch of rock and scrub forest. But step closer, and the surfaces of those rocks begin to speak. They speak not with words, but with colors, red, white, yellow, and black, daubed onto the walls thousands of years ago by hands that belonged to people long gone. This place is Bembetka, a cluster of rock shelters where some of humanity's earliest art still clings to stone. The shelters are more than caves. They are natural overhangs, chambers carved by time itself, offering shade and protection from heat, wind, and monsoon rain. For countless generations, people lived, rested, and painted here. The walls bear layered histories. Deer and bison chased by hunters, horses, and elephants marching in procession, dancers moving in circles, and warriors wielding spears. In some shelters, the paintings are so dense that newer drawings overlap the old, forming a palimpsest of lives stacked across millennia. What makes Bembetka different from other prehistoric sites is not just the number of paintings, but their persistence, where pigments elsewhere flaked and vanished. The colors here held on sometimes astonishingly fresh, as though brushed on yesterday. The red comes from hematite, ground iron oxide. The white from limestone, the yellow from ochre, the black from manganese. These minerals, mixed with water or plant sap, bonded with the porous sandstone and endured centuries of weather. When archaeologists first surveyed Bembetka in the mid-20th century, they were astonished. Some paintings were estimated to be more than 30,000 years old, among the earliest known expressions of symbolic thought. Yet the scenes did not seem lifeless relics. They carried energy, movement, and rhythm. A line of hunters with bows looked, poised to release their arrows. A herd of cattle appeared to shift as the sunlight crept across the walls. The site quickly earned recognition as one of the most important prehistoric art galleries in the world. But Bembetka was never just an archaeological site. For local villagers, the shelters were part of the living landscape. Some caves were still used for prayer, others as shade during grazing. Stories passed through generations linked the shelters to the hero Bhima from the Mahabharata, who was said to have rested here during his exile. Even the name Bembetka means the place where Bhima sat. To the people nearby, the paintings were not simply art. They were whispers of ancestry, proof that the land had always held human life. For decades, visitors marveled at the vivid colors that somehow resisted the Indian sun. Tourists climbed narrow trails to see antelope leap across the walls, horsemen ride into battle, in geometric patterns whose meanings were lost. Guides pointed out details with practiced gestures. Here, a mother cradling her child. There, a man with antlers painted upon his head. The paintings were not silent. They seemed to call out across time, showing that humans had always danced, hunted, celebrated, and dreamed. And yet, the durability of those pigments was not infinite. In recent years, something unexpected began to happen. Colors that had remained sharp for centuries began to vanish suddenly, inexplicably, and in some cases, overnight. A vibrant red deer became pale, its outline ghostly against the stone. A hunter's bow lost its string, fading into blank sandstone. Tourists who had visited once and returned a year later found walls they barely recognized. Damn, the figures were still there, but dim, as if retreating into the rock itself. The suddenness of the fading unsettled both scientists and locals. Had something changed in the environment? Modern pollution eating away at the pigments, or vibrations from nearby? Industry shaking loose fragments of stone? Or was it simply that time, which had been patient for millennia, was now reclaiming its due all at once? The shelters of Bembetka stand today as both wonder and warning. They remind us that the things we believe eternal can slip away before we realize they are fragile. The people who painted the walls are long gone, but their stories linger in color till the colors themselves vanish, leaving only empty stone. Asterisk when word spread that the once bright figures of Bembetka were dimming. Scientists, historians, and conservators converged on the site. What they saw alarmed them. Entire panels that had survived thousands of years were losing their definition in a span of just a few seasons. Hunters that had stood bold on the rock now looked like faint shadows. Bison, once painted in thick strokes of iron red, seemed to melt into the sandstone. The suddenness was the most troubling detailer that had endured monsoons, dust storms, and centuries of human touch appeared to be surrendering under modern skies. The first explanations were simple guesses. Some thought that increased rainfall in recent years had washed away the pigments. Others suspected smoke and pollution drifting from the city of Bhopal, or chemical changes in the air from nearby industries. Acid rain, long known to corrode stone monuments across the world, seemed a likely culprit. But when samples were studied, the mystery deepened. The pigments themselves were chemically stable. Hematite, for example, does not dissolve easily. It wasn't the minerals fading. Something else was happening. Archaeologists considered whether tourists had unintentionally played a role. The oils from human skin, even the faintest touch of a hand against the wall, could disturb the bond between pigment and sandstone. Some guides admitted that visitors often leaned too close, brushing the surface without realizing the damage. Photography added another suspect. Repeated camera flashes, especially in the decades before restrictions. may have degraded the paint molecules. Okay? These were small gestures, but multiplied by thousands of visitors, they formed a slow, invisible erosion. Others turned their eyes to the sandstone itself. Bembeka's shelters are porous. Water seeps through them during monsoon and evaporates in the dry season. Over centuries, this rhythm helped lock the pigments in place. But in recent decades, changes in temperature and humidity patterns disrupted that rhythm. When water entered the stone and dried too quickly, the surface crumbled. Its flakes of pigment came loose, taking entire figures with them. It was not so much that the colors had faded, was that the wall was peeling away beneath them. Some experts pointed to another culprit: modern development. Just a few kilometers from the shelters lies a highway, quarries, and mines. The vibrations from blasting and the constant thrum of trucks may seem far removed from fragile cave art. Yet sandstone is a delicate material, as tiny tremors could have shaken loose grains of pigment that had clung to the stone for millennia. What the monsoon could not erase, the rumble of engines might. But perhaps the most unsettling theory was that the fading was accelerated not by a single cause, but by all of them together. Pollution in the air, human contact, changing rainfall, industrial vibrations, even microorganisms feeding on the minerals, all of these worked in quiet unison. For thousands of years, the shelters had been balanced in harmony with their environment. Now, in the span of a single human lifetime, that balance was broken. Local communities observed the fading with their own interpretations. Some elders whispered that the spirits of the shelters were withdrawing their gifts, retreating into silence, because too many strangers had intruded. Kata said it was Bhima himself, reclaiming the colors that had been borrowed by mortals for too long. Villagers who once guided visitors now shook their heads at the pale walls, wondering if their children would see anything at all when they came of age. Conservationists attempted remedies, erecting barriers, limiting visitors, applying chemical preservatives to stabilize the walls. But such measures came with their own risks. Sprays could darken the sandstone, altering the art forever. Restricting access threatened to sever the connection between locals and their heritage. At Bembetka, preservation was not simply a scientific problem, but a human one, tangled in memory, identity, and reverence. As the debate continued, the fading itself did not pause. Colors dimmed like stars swallowed by dawn. The more people studied the shelters, the clearer the tragedy became. The art was vanishing faster than it could be fully recorded. Every year, more details slipped beyond recall. What had seemed immortal was being unmade in front of living eyes. And yet, within this slow erasure lies a haunting truth. What disappears leaves behind silence, but also memory. The people who painted these walls never meant their art to last forever. It was ritual, gesture, a way of binding their lives to the rock. Perhaps the fading is not an ending, but a reminder that time, however slow, always moves forward, and that even the strongest colors are temporary. By the early 21st century, the fate of Bembetka had become a quiet warning. Scholars rushed to document the panels, sketching outlines, photographing with advanced imaging, and creating digital reconstructions. Some used infrared scanning to reveal details invisible to the human eye, hoping to preserve what could no longer be trusted to endure on stone. In these records, ghostly figures appeared: bows, dancers, shamans, preserved not on sandstone, but in pixels. The irony was bitter. What had survived for thousands of years outdoors now needed machines to be remembered indoors. But the fading murals were more than an archaeological loss. They were also a cultural lesson in fragility. For centuries, people assumed that the past was durable, that carvings, pigments, and walls would stand against time. Yet Bembetka revealed that permanence is an illusion. Even the most resilient art, bound to the rhythms of earth and weather, can unravel in a generation if its balance is disturbed. For the scientist, The lesson was about humility. They realized that conservation is not the act of freezing time, but of listening carefully to its pace. Preserving Bembeka meant respecting the subtle exchanges between sandstone, water, sun, and air. It meant accepting that no chemical spray, no glass barrier could restore what had already been lost. The only true safeguard was balance between human presence and natural endurance for the local communities. The lesson carried a different weight. The fading shelters reminded them that heritage is not guaranteed. Elders began urging children to listen to the stories tied to the caves, to remember the songs and rituals that gave the art its meaning. If the walls disappeared, memory could still endure in words, gestures, and traditions. The loss of the paintings did not erase the people who made them, so long as their stories were carried forward. For visitors, the lesson was silence. Standing before a wall where only faint strokes remained, many reported a strange stillness. It was as if the absence itself demanded attention, the way an empty chair recalls the one who once sat in it. The vanishing colors became a mirror of mortality, proof that all things, even human creativity, fade. And yet, that fading carried beauty of its own. There is a certain dignity in impermanence. The Bembeka shelters, with their pale outlines and half-erased figures, speak not only of prehistoric life, but of the truth that nothing is immune to change. In their gradual disappearance lies a continuity with the people who painted them. They too lived, created, and were eventually gone. What remains is not only pigment on stone, but the echo of human persistence, of lives that reached across millennia to leave a mark, however faint. And so, Bembeka teaches us this. History is not a possession, but a borrowing. We inherit it for a while, tend to it if we are careful, and then pass it on in whatever form survives, whether on walls, in books, or in memory. When the colors faded overnight, they did not vanish entirely. They moved into the realm of remembrance, where they cannot be measured in brightness or hue, but in the quiet awe they inspire. Asterisk, the caves of Altamira, tucked into the hills of Cantabria in northern Spain, were once dismissed as a fraud. When the first drawings were revealed in the late 19th century, bold red bison stretched across ceilings. Horses and deer, painted with skill that rivaled modern artist critics, could not believe that Paleolithic people had made them. They assumed it must have been some clever hoax, a 19th century hand pretending to be ancient. The truth was harder to accept, that 15,000 years ago, in a world of cold winds and roaming herds, humans had already mastered art on a monumental scale. Inside the cave, the air was still and damp, the silence broken only by the drip of water echoing in chambers carved by time. The walls seemed to flicker when torches burned, the flames making the painted bison shift and move as though alive. The ceilings were never meant to be walked beneath like the halls of a palace. They were the palaces. Red ochre, black charcoal, and manganese dioxide were ground, mixed with fat or water, and carefully applied to rock surfaces. The artists blended natural contours into their designs so that the bulges of the ceiling became the haunches of animals. Shadows became manes, and cracks became horns. The most famous chamber, now called the Great Hall of the Bulls, stretched wide like a canvas suspended over the heads of its visitors. Here, the bison charged and twisted across the stone, their muscles alive in red and black, their eyes staring back through time. The figures were not casual doodles. They carried ritual, purpose. Perhaps they were part of hunting magic, a way to ensure success before the chase. Perhaps they were acts of reverence, honoring the animals that sustained life. Or perhaps there was something else entirely, expressions of a symbolic world now beyond reach. For generations, the people of the late Ice Age must have gathered here, their fires illuminating the ceiling, their voices echoing in the chamber as they gestured toward the painted forms. Children may have watched in awe, okay, learning not just about animals, but about belonging to a community that understood its survival. As bound to the creatures painted above, the cave was not a gallery. It was a ritual hall, a place where shadows, pigments, okay, and stories converged to sustain meaning. But the paintings were fragile from the beginning. The pigments, though vivid, clung delicately to the limestone, okay, endured in darkness, in stable air, because the cave was sealed off from the changing world outside. When the paintings were first discovered and then celebrated as authentic masterpieces of prehistory, people began to enter in droves. Tourists carried in light, moisture, heat, and breath. Slowly, the environment of the cave shifted. Invisible organisms found footholds where before there had been none. And soon, what had lasted 4 millennia began to change. The bison of Altamira, once forgotten in darkness, were now too visible, too exposed. Okay. Their fate was sealed, not by neglect, okay, but by attention. Asterisk, the rediscovery of Altamira's paintings in 1879 changed everything. At first, they were doubted, dismissed as forgeries, too perfect to be real. But as other caves in France and Spain revealed their own ancient art, the truth of Altamira's authenticity became undeniable. Overnight, the cave transformed from a quiet geological hollow into a pilgrimage site. Scholars, dignitaries, and tourists came to marvel at the so-called Sistine Chapel of prehistory. Yet every visitor brought more than curiosity. It brought breath-warm air filled with moisture, carbon dioxide, and microscopic particles. Over years, these tiny intrusions accumulated into a slow transformation, which pretends of thousands of years had been a closed, stable chamber, began to shift into a different environment. Walls that once held pigment in steady silence now began to sweat. A fine film of condensation gathered on surfaces, carrying minerals and fostering the growth of organisms. By the mid-20th century, alarm bells began to sound. Conservators noticed faint green stains creeping along the edges of bison and deer. These were colonies of algae, thriving in the moisture left behind by visitors. Dark patches of mold also appeared, burrowing into the porous limestone. Akich. New outbreaks carred the paintings that had survived millennia untouched. Cave had become too famous for its own good. To counter this, the cave's managers tried to limit access. Fewer tickets were sold. Lights were turned down. Damage was already underway. Even careful footsteps stirred invisible currents of dust and humidity. The walls had grown accustomed to darkness. Now they were illuminated by lamps, their surfaces absorbing the heat. Subtle changes in the cave's microclimate made pigments flake, fade, and soften. Some outlines of animals blurred, as if they were dissolving into the rock itself. The bison, once so vivid that they seemed to breathe with firelight, were beginning to look tired. Their reds lost brilliance, their blacks dulled, and their outlines grew fragile under an invasion of microbes. In some places, patches of lichen spread across the painted surfaces like pale veils. Generations who had gathered to marvel at Altamira's glory unwittingly brought its decline. The very act of looking, something the first painters may never have intended for outsiders, had become destructive. Each gasp of wonder left behind a trace of decay. By the late 20th century, officials made the painful decision. The caves would have to be closed to the public. A replica would be created for tourists, while the real chamber, sealed once more, returned to darkness. But the damage was not so easily undone. In the quiet of the closed cave, unseen armies of bacteria continued their slow assault. Socialists fought back with treatments, cleaning surfaces, controlling the climate, sealing the chamber again and again. Yet the question lingered. Could the paintings be truly preserved, or were they destined to vanish no matter what was done? The lost bison of Altamira's dark hall were not destroyed, in some ancient catastrophe. Their slow disappearance was the result of modern curiosity, a paradox, where love for the past became the force that erased it. Today, the real Altamira cave lies sealed in deliberate stillness. Few human feet touch its stone floor. Its entry is strictly rationed only. A handful of people each year, chosen almost ceremonially, are allowed to step into its darkness. They wear protective suits. Their visits are short. Their presence is monitored like a delicate experiment. Even so, questions linger in the air. Is any contact safe at all? For the wider world, the cave has become a memory more than a place. The great painted ceiling, the bison rolling in ochre, the deer leaping in black strokes has been replicated with extraordinary detail in a nearby museum. Tourists come by the thousands to stand beneath the replica, whispering as if in reverence, even though the pigments above them are not ancient but modern reconstructions. The replica is almost perfect, down to the cracks in the limestone. Yet perfection is precisely its tragedy. It reminds us of what we cannot touch, of what is slipping away in the original dot, inside the true cave. The silence is heavy. Conservation. Teams monitor sensors that track humidity, carbon dioxide, microbial colonies, and temperature shifts. Reports are written in cautious tones, describing outbreaks of green algae, fungal blooms, porn, faint discolorations, as if chronicling an illness. The cave is alive in ways that threaten its art, a living ecosystem that no longer cares about human memory. The fate of Altamira reflects an uncomfortable truth about heritage. Some treasures cannot survive being shared. The Paleolithic artists, painted in secrecy, perhaps for ritual, perhaps for private meaning. Their work lasted tens of thousands of years because no one disturbed it. In less than 2 centuries of modern attention, those same works nearly vanished. So now the question hovers, unresolved. What is the true Altamira? The sealed, fragile chamber where the bison fade in private silence, or the replica, brightly lit and accessible, where countless visitors can gaze upon an imitation of something too delicate to endure their presence? Perhaps the answer is both. The real cave continues to exist, but only as a shadow behind glass, while the replica has become its public face. A strange half-life between memory and reality, and somewhere in that dim hall, where bison still arch, their backs against a red ceiling, the air is as it was in the Ice Age, cool, damp, unmoving. The walls breathe slowly, untouched by torchlight or chatter. The art remains, but it is fading, carrying with it not only images of animals, but the entire mystery of why they were painted in the first place. When the last pigment finally dissolves, will we even notice? Or will we already have accepted the replica as the truth, forgetting that in a sealed cave in Cantabria, the originals once glowed in firelight? Asterisk, in the endless sandstone plateau of Tassili Najar, southern Algeria, the desert stretches like an ocean turned to stone. Wind whistles. Across canyons carved by time, sand drifts into hollows, and the silence feels almost absolute. Yet within this silence, the rocks tell stories painted in engraved scenes left by people who lived here thousands of years ago, when the Sahara was not a desert at all, but a green world of rivers, grass, and herds. The walls of Tassili are alive with memory. Herds of cattle stretch across the stone, drawn with careful horns and spotted hides. Hunters raise bows, their figures frozen mid-step. Dancers twirl in arcs of ochre. Strange beings with round, mask-like heads float in the panels, their meaning unclear spirits, ancestors, or visitors from some imagined world. These images earned the site its name as the open-air museum of the Sahara, and they cover the rocks as though the land itself is a canvas. But among these scenes of life, there is one wall that refuses to speak in a secluded corner. High on a ridge that is difficult to reach, lies a slab of rock that is almost perfectly blank. Its smoothness seems unnatural compared to the rugged surfaces around it. It is as if something once filled the stone and then suddenly vanished. Scholars who study the plateau often pass over this rock quickly, their attention drawn to the richer scenes nearby. Yet to others, this absence is more haunting than the paintings that survive. Why does this wall stand empty when all around it the sandstone pulses with images? Did the people who painted here deliberately leave it bare, as though saving it for something that never came? Or was it once filled with art, scraped away, washed clean, or erased by forces we cannot trace? The locals who live on the edges of the plateau sometimes tell quiet stories. They say that in their grandparents' youth, faint markings were still visible shapes of animals or spirits that had faded almost to invisibility. Some insist that French explorers in the 1930s mentioned strange outlines here, though no record has been found. Others believe the wall is cursed, that whatever was painted there was not meant to be remembered. And so, the rock remains, a surface without memory, standing in the middle of a land overflowing with it. Its silence feels deliberate, like a missing page torn from a book. Was this blankness an accident of erosion or a secret erased on purpose? Asterisk, the plateau of Tassili Nasr stretches like a labyrinth, its cliffs and arches rising from the sand as though they were monuments built not by humans but by time itself. For decades, explorers and archaeologists have wandered through these canyons, tracing every mark, every brushstroke, every groove. When Henry Lote led his famous expedition in the 1950s, he cataloged thousands of paintings and engravings, yet even in his exhaustive records, the smooth, blank wall is barely mentioned. Few notes, a passing sketch, but no detail, as though the silence of the wall had seeped into the pens of those who tried to describe it. Some researchers believe the wall once held paintings of cattle, similar to the grand herds that dominate other parts of the plateau. In the humid green Sahara period, between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, cattle were at the heart of life. Rock art from this era celebrates them endlessly grazing, being milked, even being decorated for ritual. If the blank wall once held such scenes, then its erasure would mean not only the loss of art, but the loss of a testimony to daily life. Others argue the opposite, that the wall may have carried something entirely unique. Among Tassili's surviving images are strange figures, the so-called round-head beings, painted with bulbous masks and long, tapering bodies. They are unlike the cattle paintings, unlike the hunters, unlike anything found elsewhere in Africa. Some scholars call them shamans. Others whisper, more controversially, of ancient visitors. If such beings once adorned the blank wall, then perhaps their erasure was intentional. There are even traces tiny discolorations on the stone that some interpret as the remnants of pigment. Not much remains, just hints of a different texture, where water and wind have not smoothed the surface entirely. To the patient eye, it looks as though faint shapes once lingered here, a curve that could have been a horn, a line that could have been an arm. But these impressions are like clouds, seen by some, dismissed by others. The desert itself may be the culprit. Sandstorms are merciless, their grains like knives scraping against the rock. Over thousands of years, paintings can vanish beneath such abrasion. And yet, on nearby walls, just a few paces away, images survive in remarkable clarity. Faces of cattle, the gestures of humans, the marks of ritual. Why, then, did this one wall succumb so fully to time, while others resisted? This question has given rise to whispers that perhaps the people of Tassili themselves erased it. Some point to engraved lines elsewhere on the plateau, where older paintings were deliberately scraped away to make room for newer ones. The artists of the desert were not passive recorders of life, They were active editors of memory, To to erase a painting may have been as important a ritual act as creating one. If the blank wall was cleared by human hands, the question becomes heavier. What was so dangerous, so sacred, or so forbidden that it had to vanish entirely? And why does the silence of that rock feel heavier than the voices of all the others? The blank wall of Tassili N'Ajjer does not remain truly empty in the imagination. Its silence has become a canvas on which scholars, explorers, and dreamers project their own visions. One of the most grounded theories suggests the missing paintings depicted rituals too sacred to be seen by outsiders. Among pastoralist cultures, certain ceremonies, initiation rites, healing dances, offerings to spirits were kept secret, performed only in the presence of those permitted to witness them. Perhaps the blank wall once bore such images. Later, generations, fearing their power or wishing to guard their mystery, might have deliberately scraped them away. To erase a ritual from sight was not to erase it from memory, it was to protect it. Another possibility lies in the changing climate. The Sahara was once green, dotted with rivers and lakes, alive with fish, cattle, and game. As the desert dried, so too did its culture shift. What was once celebrated, the abundance of water, the wealth of cattle, may later have become painful reminders of loss. Could the blank wall have held joyful depictions of a world that no longer existed? If so, the erasure may have been less an act of secrecy than an act of mourning. To wipe away the painted lakes was to accept that they had disappeared. Then there are the stranger interpretations. The round-head figures, with their mask-like faces and elongated bodies, have long puzzled archaeologists. They belong to a period before the cattle paintings, possibly as far back as 9,000 years ago. Some believe they represent shamans in trance, their bodies distorted by visions. Others, looking with modern eyes, have suggested extraterrestrial beings, a hypothesis more popular among fringe theorists than among academics. But it is true that a few of these figures do resemble helmets, suits, or otherworldly forms. If such beings were painted on the blank wall, and if later generations feared or misunderstood them, perhaps the images were removed to cleanse the sight of their unsettling presence. A final, quieter theory rests on the stone itself. Some walls in Tassili were chosen because they were perfect canvases, smooth, broad, and resilient. But sometimes the rock fails. Water seeps into tiny cracks, salt blooms beneath the surface, and the pigments crumble away. The blank wall may not be erased, and all it may simply have betrayed its artists. What they painted could never last, and yet this explanation satisfies no one. For if it were merely natural decay, why do nearby paintings endure so vividly? Why this wall, and only this wall? The emptiness of Tassili's blank rock reminds us of something often forgotten in archaeology, that absence is also an artifact. The silence of the wall is as much a message as the herds of cattle or the round-headed spirits. Whether it was scraped by human hands, erased by sand, or abandoned to its own fragility, it holds meaning in its very refusal to tell us more. In the end, perhaps the true mystery of Tassili's blank wall is that it forces us to confront the limits of knowledge. Some stories are not lost, they are withheld, and standing before that silent canvas, one must wonder, was it erased for us, the strangers of the future, so that we might never fully know what those people once saw?